So maybe as a brief recap, because I guess what we're talking about today is going to be very much building on what we talked about last time, because I guess I didn't quite realize last time until about halfway through the conversation what actually was going on.
Yeah, me neither.
It's not really that complex of a topic, but somehow it took me about an hour. I guess as a brief recap, so last time, which was about 10 months ago, we talked about things could be better, what you're doing with Substack, some of the content there. And then halfway through, I realized that things could be better is actually the final product. You're not submitting this to a journal.
Yep.
And yeah, at the time, you said, I think you're trying to apply for tenure track positions and you're hoping that someone's going to give you the chance to kind of try your crazy experiment out. And then I think literally 3 weeks later, you announced you were going to go to Substack full time. So, yeah, I guess we'll be kind of questioning some of the academic norms, some things going on, exploring some slightly unusual paths that especially you've taken. So maybe as a very kind of straightforward question, maybe kind of what have you been doing in the last 10 months? Kind of since when have you been doing the Substack full time? When did your position end? And kind of, yeah.
So I found out, I guess, at the end of last year or early this year that I was at Columbia doing a position that was part research, part teaching. And I thought I was going to have a third year there and then found out that I wasn't. And so in January of this year, I had to figure out okay, what am I doing for a paycheck and health insurance, which in the UK are very separate, or one is not guaranteed, right? Come July. And
in the US, you mean? Oh,
what's that?
In the US, you mean?
Yes.
The separate, yeah.
Yes.
I think you said UK. Anyway, it doesn't matter, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, well, I used to live in the UK. Maybe my brain is still there. So I was like, okay, I need to do something 6 months from now to not die. And at the time, I hadn't even started taking paid subscriptions on my Substack. I had no idea how it was going to work. But also at the time, there was a postdoc out for a guy at Kellogg, which is the business school at Northwestern. And a friend of mine was like, hey, he reads your blog. And you don't have really any research interests in common, but I know he likes your stuff. Why don't you reach out to him? And so I was like, hey, would you be interested in working with me, even though it doesn't really make sense? He was like, yeah, actually. And so started doing that. I committed to doing that. And so I'm still writing the Substack and doing that. But that was the thing that I was like, okay, here's how I'm going to not die in the meantime. And if I had known how well Substack was going to go back then, maybe I would have been like, okay, now is the time to break ranks forever. But it is still the thing that I spend the most time on. So I'm fortunate that my position has a lot of flexibility. I mean, in fact, 10 months, I was at Columbia actually, or finishing Columbia for most of that. Over the summer, I was getting married. And then just this month, I've started this postdoc, which again, if I had known what I would be able to do, I might have been like, oh, maybe I shouldn't do this. But now I've kind of committed to doing it. So I can give you a better answer for what have I been doing for the past 10 months, trying to see through what can I do with this different way of developing ideas. And really I don't have exactly a plan of here is what the next 10 years of my research that I do on Substack looks like. It really feels more like a series of demonic possessions that each new idea comes and I can't think about anything else. And the only way to kind of exorcise that demon is to put it in the form of a post on experimental history. If there is anything that is a through line that I want to draw out, maybe for the next 5 or 10 years, it is trying to find a paradigm for psychology that I think almost basically no one is working on. And I think is really hard to do within the structures that academia affords you, because it's very good at incentivizing basically doing normal science. It is not good at providing a structure for doing revolutionary science, right? It's actually a very conservative institution. And I think if someone is going to do that work of exploring it, they have to occupy a sort of weird niche in the ecosystem. And that is a niche that I've been able to carve out somewhat. And so I want to take advantage of.
Yeah, you mean the kind of, sorry, I'm going to call it a niche, but the niche of the kind of slight outsider, someone who's not really completely outside, but on the edge, basically.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I know I come off as very critical of academia a lot, but it's not I want to burn it down or I'm I'd never want to touch it at all. Because I think those are also those are just reactionary positions, right? You allow yourself to be defined by the thing that you don't like. that I think academia is optimized for solving certain kinds of problems, but you can't optimize for solving all kinds of problems. So you need like different configurations of optimization to explore all the possible like problem space. So like I do harbor some ill will toward its greater abuses, but it's not like I want to take a wrecking ball to it and knock it over. I would rather use that wrecking ball to like carve out more space to do more different things. Because I don't think we actually gain from like removing bricks from on top of bricks. I think we gain by putting more bricks on top of other bricks.
Yeah, or at least building a little side house.
Yes,
like a sidecar to the house, if that makes sense. Okay, just I don't think we were going to get there quite as early, but I guess I want to pick up on the through line you mentioned of trying to develop a paradigm for psychology. I mean, this is going to be obviously this is a big topic, and maybe I'm just going to be rude and throw a big question at you. But what exactly is the problem with the current paradigm or lack of paradigm in psychology?
Oh yeah, well, the problem with not having a paradigm is that it's pretty unclear like what matters and what's important and how to build anything on anything else. That doesn't mean it's impossible to do work that will ultimately matter, but it does make it very difficult to recognize that work when it happens. And so it can be useful to think of like how other sciences made this transition, right? That like before chemistry, there were a lot of people doing things that looked a lot like chemistry. They thought of it as alchemy, and we're mixing things together and we're heating things up a lot, and we're trying to purify things, and we're wondering like what's in air. And some of those things turned out to be pretty important, but a lot of the times people didn't even understand what the importance was until we developed a better way of thinking about those things. And in some cases, it wasn't like they could have just developed a paradigm for chemistry, in like 1530. They hadn't discovered enough things at that point to be able to even say something sensical, right? You can't have, for instance, the periodic table until you know about atomic mass. And so we might not be yet at a point in psychology where we've actually like observed the empirical phenomena enough to know how to like sort it correctly. And so this may all be for naught. But it could be possible that it's certainly the case that we will never actually find that paradigm if we don't try to develop one. That like our version of normal science is like to do the things that is required to continue to produce journal articles. And like that is actually the closest thing that we have to a paradigm. Like there's a bunch of like weird different assumptions, but no one I think can really tell you like what it is that we do. So I had like a back and forth with Paul Bloom recently where like I had written an article about like proto-paradigms in psychology. He wrote an article about how psychology is actually okay. And he's like, here's this list of all the, of a bunch of important findings. And I'm like, yeah, it's good that we have a list, but like a list is not a paradigm. And if all that we have is a list, then are we just list lengtheners? Like, if you want to be a psychologist, is that all you do? I just tried to like get like entry number 497 on the list. Like, what happens when we double that list? What happens when we triple that list? Have we actually come to better understand the mind, or do we just have a longer list of facts? I mean, you'll notice that like chemistry is not just a list of facts. Like, it does have a model of how the world works and how the facts interact with one another. I don't think we really have that. I think we have a few collections of facts that have some relationship to each other, but they're pretty separate and disparate. And there's not an easy way to know like how might you find a fact that's useful in those collections of facts.
From the example of chemistry, do you know whether... I mean, I know nothing about chemistry. It's my least favorite topic of all of them. But do you know whether the people who, came up with the paradigm, basically, were they trying to come up with a paradigm, or were they also just fiddling around with things and suddenly it just like kind of fell into place, and then everyone realized like, oh, here's a way, here's a model to structure our thoughts around, or our findings around.
Yeah, I don't think I know the history of science enough to answer that conclusively, but they definitely didn't have the concept of a paradigm, right? Even if they were, like, they certainly didn't have the word, because we didn't really invent the word until like 1963. So they might have had some inkling of the thing that they were doing, which makes it remarkable that they were able to do it even without the concept as well developed as we have it now. Which is why I'm actually much more hopeful for being able to do this in psychology, because we have the example of other sciences that have done it, and we have more of a conceptual framework for understanding what it is that we're doing. When you're just living in the physical world being like, I don't know, there seems to be a bunch of different kinds of stuff, and like some seems like earth, and some seems like fire, and some seems like air, and that seems pretty good. I think it takes a pretty big stroke of insight to go like, no, that doesn't seem to be carving nature at its joints. That like what we call earth, I think, is many different things that don't all operate the same way. And what we call fire might not even be a substance at all. It's really hard to go from the framework of like there are 4 elements to the framework of like, no, there's actually many elements and here's what an element is.
And you can structure them. And
Yeah. That's why I think it's so difficult to have that same kind of understanding for psychology, that like to put ourselves in the mindset of someone who exists early in history rather than late. Because if you think that we are late in psychology's history, you kind of think that like this is our final form. But if you like appreciate the fact that like something like what we are doing is going to be happening 500 years from now, God willing, will they be doing what we are doing? And I certainly hope not. I think it will look really different, and I think we'll look very strange to them. I think we will look as strange to them as alchemists look to us, which I think I find very humbling, but also very inspiring.
Yeah. Just since you've lived in the UK, you might know the Blackadder episode where they're trying to create gold and he creates green. For those who've seen that, he created some pure green. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's usually the case that you kind of look back on the stuff people did in the past, or you yourself did in the past, and go like, what was I thinking? Such a dumb idea. So is your kind of longish term approach then to kind of have this parallel track where you try and have some findings and at the same time take a meta perspective of like how this whole thing works, or completely going the meta perspective and becoming a philosopher of science?
I think both. I mean, I think a useful paradigm is only useful if it can like help you produce empirical results that make sense. So I don't think this is going to be a completely or even mainly a philosophical like enterprise. That, I mean, much like when you have a periodic table, you go like, oh, we're missing number 47. Like, we might have this right as a way of organizing our knowledge if we can find number 47. If number 47 isn't there, we're really wrong about the way that we're thinking about this. And yeah, I think a useful paradigm for psychology will have something similar.
Do you have any inkling of what this is going to be?
I do a little bit, but I think not enough to discuss it now. I think like the idea is too tender to really hold up to scrutiny.
I understand what you mean. Like you saying something that's like half baked, and then everyone. Yeah. I mean, not everyone trashes it, but I know what you mean. Yeah.
So come back to me in 5 years.
Okay, I'll write it in the calendar. Yeah. I mean, that would be a good podcast episode. Yeah. We have a paradigm for psychology now.
We've done it.
I'll take it.
But even then, I think the best case reasonable scenario isn't going to be that like, we can slot everything that we know into this right now. I think it's going to be able to capture some chunk of facts. And then I think it's going to do like a less good job of explaining facts that are on the border of that. And I think it's not going to have much at all to say about a whole class of facts. Right, because what we think about as psychology is like a bunch of weird different things. And it's not clear like what are going to be the things that all fall together and what are going to be the things that like don't really make sense to think about in the same paradigm. I mean, much like Newtonian physics versus quantum physics, right? That like there is a paradigm that makes a lot of sense at a certain level of explanation, and then it doesn't make any sense at a different level of explanation or a different level of analysis. And like we don't even have the first part, right? So it's hard to know like where's that first part going to end, but it will end, I think, somewhere. So I don't think it's going to be that like we can shred all of the stuff that we've found, or we can like boil it down and pour it into this mold that we now have. I think we're going to get some of it in there, and we're not going to get all of it. I think it's also going to be a challenge for it in the first place because it's not going to be able to explain or make sense of everything. Only some things, but I think it'll make sense of some things very well.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to me there are some perspectives, especially from evolution biology, where people try and kind of take that as kind of the backbone of a paradigm. I mean, there's the problem is I don't know these well enough to almost even say what they are. I think it's the cultural inheritance theory or something like that. I can't remember what it was. I'll be talking to someone about it at some point, so I'll have to read up a bit more about that particular point. But are you, I mean, from what you strike me as someone who's like very much purely psychological, right? With very little biology or neuroscience. Yeah. I mean, neuroscience is biology also, but for those kinds of things, a new paradigm.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of things like this in psychology that look like that I think are better thought of as explanations rather than paradigms. That like whatever paradigm we have in psychology, will have to make sense in the light of evolution. But we've had evolution for a long time, and it hasn't really given us, like, it hasn't helped us chart our course in psychology, right? Like, the things that we discover have to comport with it in some sense, which we mainly do by like constructing stories about like why it would make sense evolutionarily for this thing to exist. But it doesn't seem like it's done a lot of work in terms of like telling us where to look next or giving us some idea of how the mind might be structured. It's more of a constraint, I think, rather than a guide. I think there's some exceptions to this, right? That like the Cosmides and Tooby stuff about like it would make sense that we are very sensitive to detecting cheaters, and like that can make some weird things make more sense. Like that seems good, but if we had 100 more of those, I would feel a little more confident. But I think like we have like a smattering of those, and then we have a lot of things that's like, well, this makes sense in light of evolution. So it doesn't seem like it's really fulfilled the role that we like hope that it will, even though it's obviously a constraint on whatever work that we do.
Well, I wonder actually how, I mean, this is again, I don't know enough about most things, especially evolutionary, like evolutionary biology or whatever, but it seems from someone who doesn't, let's say, actively work on that kind of area and doesn't read much about it, to me, it doesn't seem like it actually provides many constraints. I don't know, maybe someone who knows more about that will say actually does provide lots of constraints, but I don't know.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, it might be a pretty loose constraint, right? That like ultimately the way the mind works has to make sense in terms of like it has to be able that it evolved in some way. It has to make sense as to why it would be that way in our ancestral environment, which is also constrained by like what we know of that ancestral environment to be. But yeah, it doesn't really say that like the mind has to be like very parallel versus very serial. Like I don't think it gives you a guide for that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, maybe to go a little bit into from the very big like paradigm creation of psychology to the maybe slightly more concrete of how people actually do that as scientists, or as maybe can we start with your article about the secret society and the invitation that you just handed out to anyone, basically?
Yeah.
And maybe why you don't particularly like the term citizen science.
Oh, yeah. So yeah, in this post, it was basically a blanket invitation to anyone to do science and post about it on the internet, which obviously I'm not the emperor of science, right? I don't get to decide whether people get to do that or not, but sometimes people can use a little push, and sometimes people need to feel like they've been given permission to do something. And I think it used to be much more common for people to feel like they had this permission. But when professional science exists, I think it sort of implies that unless you are part of the profession, you do not have permission. So the idea was, if you're interested, you should do some science. You should post it on the internet. And I did a few things to try to help people do that. One was starting a Discord, which now has like 120 people in it or something, of people who are trying to answer scientific questions, mainly outside of the traditional structures of academia. It's a really cool mix of people. I was a little bit worried that like I was going to get a bunch of cranks who were like, yeah, I've got my theory of everything that like no one understands. Like I did hear from a few of those people, but it was remarkable how many people were like, hey, I've been working on something a lot just on my own, and I'm looking for other people to talk to. And there were a lot of people who were like, I have a foot in academia, but I don't like the structures of it for whatever reason, and so I'm looking for ways of expressing myself outside of that. And I think this is really important because I think we need people taking a lot of different approaches to asking questions and communicating them. And that academia is optimized for like a certain way of doing that, but you can't optimize for solving all problems. And so what you really want is many people optimizing for different ways of solving problems. And it might turn out that like some of those ways are pretty bad. In fact, most of those ways are probably pretty bad. But we don't know a priori most of the time whether this question is going to be a good use of time or not. And so why not have many people doing many different things? Because if one of them finds something useful, then we all get to benefit from it. So this is really based on the strong link science idea, right? That we progress at this pace that we make, that we do our best work. And like our bad work in the long term really doesn't matter at all. And so I don't mind that there's a bunch of amateurs out there who might produce a PDF on the internet that like isn't useful or true. Because actually it turns out that most professional scientists are also doing that. And it doesn't really matter, because if one of them produces a PDF on the internet that is really important and that is true, then we all benefit from it. And that's something that would not have happened right inside the structures of traditional science.
Can you explain the strong link, weak link a little bit more? And I think there are some Maybe can you explain a bit and then maybe.
Yeah. So I think you can usefully divide problems into two categories of strong link problems and weak link problems. So in a weak link problem, the problem is the worst things, or you care about the things that are the worst. So most instances of like safety are weak link problems. If you go into the grocery store, you don't care how safe the safest product is. You care how safe the least safe product is, right? If something in the grocery store is going to kill you, you don't want to shop at that grocery store. And you don't care if they're like, we've made the safest slice of pork in this. Like now, instead of having a 1 in 1 trillion chance of killing you, it has a 1 in 2 trillion chance of killing you. Like that matters. I mean, first of all, it'd be like, well, why does that have any chance of killing me? But you really worry about the thing that has a 1 in 100 chance of killing you. And you really would like that to go from a 1 in 100 chance to a 1 in a trillion chance. So that's a weak link problem where you care about the worst things, but not all problems are like that. Some are strong link problems where you care about how well you're doing at the best parts. So you care about the strongest links. So if you are trying to, for instance, win your country a gold medal in the Olympics, what you care about is how fast your fastest runner is. You don't care about making your slowest runner 10% faster. You care about making your fastest runner 10% faster. And so the point is being that science is a strong link problem, but we often treat it like a weak link problem. So we progress at the rate that we do our best work. When we discover relativity, we all benefit from it. If we had 100 other theories that were incorrect and that didn't make correct predictions, in the long run, it doesn't matter. In the short run, it seems to matter a lot because we can be confused or we can be misled, we can waste resources. But in the long run, these things tend to work themselves out because the truth is more powerful than falsehood.
That sounds like a bit of an assumption though, right? Rather than a conclusion as you stated.
Yeah, I mean, I basically think that if you do science, I don't know how you can do it without this belief that the truth is stronger than falsehood. Because if you don't believe that, then, I don't know, what are you doing? Like, what are you discovering? Is this all just a social construct where it just depends on who says something the loudest? Like, I think true things are more powerful because you can use them to do something. I think a good example of this is, I use this in the piece, Isaac Newton was an alchemist and spent a lot of time trying to find a philosopher's stone, right? And wrote down a recipe for making, not exactly a philosopher's stone, a precursor to a philosopher's stone, even more arcane. And virtually nobody knows about that. We obviously don't use it. Whereas we do remember the optics, the laws of motion. And why do we remember one but not the other? Well, it turned out that one was useful and the other wasn't. You can't make a philosopher's stone. We can't do it. And I think you can test yourself as to whether you are a strong link or a weak link theorist by asking yourself, how many laws of motion would you give up to get rid of the philosopher's stone recipe? And for me, the answer is 0. I would be happy. I'd be perfectly happy if Isaac Newton had to do 1,000 more philosopher's stone papers if it meant that we still get to have the laws of motion. Those were so important. There's no amount of his good work that I would delete in order to get rid of his bad work because time did that. It didn't happen immediately, right? At the time, people looking at that work might have thought that both of those things are equally important. It wasn't until maybe 100 years later that it became embarrassing to be trying to find a philosopher's stone, which is also why I think the amount of gatekeeping that we do doesn't make sense for trying to solve a strong link problem. It only makes sense if you think that you can look hundreds of years into the future and know which things are going to be the strong links. It would make total sense to have someone adjudicating this if it were possible, right? If there were an omnipotent gatekeeper who could go this is true and important and that's not true and not, it would make sense as to why we would want a lot of gatekeeping at the level of production of scientific ideas. But we can't do that, right? Newton himself couldn't tell you the difference between the laws of motion and a philosopher's stone. And no one else at the time could. It's what would the benefit have been of treating this like a weak link problem where we try to suppress the worst work because we can't actually tell the difference at that time scale between the best and the worst work. But that's not because there is no difference. There will be a very big difference. It's just not a difference that we can perceive at that time scale.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been thinking about some of the examples you used from other disciplines and about weak and strong link problems. And to maybe provide us an example that I think is maybe slightly more suitable to science than the competition one, because a competition is a bit of an artificial scenario with the Olympics. But I was just thinking as you were talking about this about music, because that's something I almost ended up doing professionally, especially classical music. And it's kind of interesting to think about it because, it doesn't really matter whether there were 100 people at home composing stuff that was terrible. Like, that doesn't take away from the great works that exist.
Yeah.
And in the same way, also what was kind of interesting is that in music, you tend to have these, you always have trends of like, even 400 years ago, whatever, people who were like super hyped at the time and now have kind of fallen away quite a bit. Especially if you look at Baroque music, Bach was not the most famous Baroque composer at the time. It was probably Telemann or whoever. And he kind of fell away for like 100 years or something. And then he was like rediscovered in the 19th century almost. When people were like, wait a minute, this is really good stuff. I mean, part of me wonders whether, there's obviously some survivorship bias here, where someone wrote something down and people forgot about it and then his house burnt down and then that was it. But in principle, I think I do agree with you. I guess I just wonder to some extent. I guess you can still have like people who are super influential for one reason or another, and it just detracts so much from the actually good stuff. Is it more that it just slows everything down a bit rather than how do you view those kind of things where someone, is super influential, guides an entire department basically into nowhere? As maybe Newton did back in the day.
Yeah.
But,
No, I think that's the right way to think about it. That like you can slow this down, and conceivably, right? Like you could have killed Isaac Newton and burned all his papers, and like we would have lost that work. That like part of this assumes that you at least transmit the idea well enough that it can be sustained for as long as it takes for it to be discovered again. Much like we could have burned Bach's works and never known. But like, so long as the idea is still present and findable, I think all you can do is slow it down. Like I don't think you can stop the march of truth permanently. I think if you do think that, I don't know. I think it's just a totally different model of how epistemology works, which I think requires something like believing like there is no such thing as reality, and like truth is not more powerful than falsehood, and like somehow you can build just as good of a bridge using the wrong theory of how bridges work than you can with the right one. I just think that's false. That like I think the correct theories tend to hold up the bridges better than the incorrect theories.
Is part of my slight skepticism towards this then maybe because most of psychology isn't useful?
Yeah.
I'm wondering, because I have the skepticism towards what you're saying, some of it, right? And because, you can think of someone, you tell them something that's really cool and they go like, oh, whatever, because I don't get it. But yeah, maybe it's just because the example of how useful it is doesn't exist because it isn't that useful.
Yeah, yes. That like, I think if what you're hoping to do is like justify most of the psychology that we have right now, I think this will be very difficult to swallow because most of that might go away. But also, like, most of alchemy went away, and there were many, like, perfectly good people who were learned people at the time, like, working assiduously at advancing the frontiers of alchemy. They discovered some useful things that stuck around, and, like, everything else went away. And it is entirely possible that most of what we do now, and most of what we have done so far, might go away. I don't think all of it, but a lot of it. Which is a really, I think, different perspective at looking at what we do. That if you think that we are early in our history, I think you'll behave very differently than if you think we are late in our history. And I think we're early in our history.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, to me, thinking about these things and some of the other articles you wrote about this, it really makes me take this much longer kind of perspective, because I feel like, especially if you're in academia, like, oh, I have to get this paper finished so I can like get a postdoc position, so, because I want to apply for this grant, and there's this very, very small scale thinking rather than going like, let's see if this works, and then or like whether this idea is useful if I apply it to this or that, and I think it's very useful. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think it's unfortunate that I think academia optimizes for that. That theoretically it's supposed to like give you a bunch of freedom to think long term about the most important problems. But have you met a lot of people who are doing that? Like, I don't meet a lot of people who seem to be thinking enjoying all their freedom and thinking long term about the most important problems. I find a lot of people who are like really trying to solve the immediate problem of publishing a paper. Even tenured professors. Like I was having a discussion recently with a tenured professor who was like, I'd really like to do this thing, but everybody expects me to do this other thing, and like it'd be really hard. It would be like socially costly to like change what I'm doing. And I'm like, if you can't do this, if you, the person with the most like job security of anybody in the world, short of like a Supreme Court justice, right? If you can't do this, then who can? And I think it's an illusion that like it'll get easier in the future. And I think that this is like a very pernicious illusion that like, I gotta pay in now and then I'll like draw out later. Like, I just don't think so. I would believe it if it felt like, yeah, everywhere I see people who are like, well, paid my dues, but now I'm free and doing the work that's most important. If I saw a lot of that, I'd go like, oh, maybe this is a good model for living one's life.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the main problem is just that no matter how, I mean, for example, there are some people, let's take a very small scale example here of people saying like, oh, Elsevier is taking too much profit, I'm not going to publish with Elsevier anymore. There's almost no, I mean, there's lots of people, there was a long list that went around a few years ago where people, signed it publicly or whatever. But most of those people still publish with Elsevier because it's always like, well, it's my PhD student. I'm not going to actively harm their career by not allowing them to publish in this journal. So it's always it seems to me it's always the case where once you get tenure, well, now you have responsibility for people who don't.
Yeah, I think
those are mainly the people you're interacting with. Yeah,
I think that's exactly the problem. That like what people don't think about this like suffer now, enjoy later paradigm is like as you suffer, you take on a bunch of commitments that like make sense to you while you're in the suffering period, but that you don't just get to shed when you're in the enjoyment period. So yeah, you're going to have responsibilities to students. You're also going to have a bunch of like collaborators who expect you to keep doing what you're doing. You're going to have colleagues who like are getting awards. And now it kind of feels like you should keep doing that. You're going to have a dean who, even though they can't fire you, might be like, hey, you haven't published anything, or colleagues who think that like you're not pulling your weight. This is also why I think a lot of young people have this temptation of like, well, I could just do this thing and make a lot of money for a period of time, and then I'll like do the thing that I really want to do. But while you're doing that, you are subjecting yourself to all the norms of the people who make money because they think it's a good long-term thing to do. And like, I just don't think that you can flip this on and off. Like, you become the things that you choose to do, certainly over the long period of time. And so like in the academic sense that, if you commit from the first day of your PhD to the first day of your tenure, that could easily be like 12 years, often much longer than that, of living in one mode of life. And I don't know, I don't think it's easy to switch back to the other mode of life. I think you've kind of forgotten how to live like that. Yeah,
and you start justifying things for why it's necessary after all, and you go, well, actually, if I did this, I would get more money to do the thing. And that,
yeah, just pay because a little more.
The whole, yeah, exactly. But okay, so if only there was someone who tried to break out of this norm. So, how are you dealing with this now with collaborators or whatever? Do you just only find people who go like, yeah, fuck it, I don't care? Or do you have a lot of convincing to do? Or
it's a mix. So like it is not something that happens right away. And I think that's also an illusion that people have, that like, I choose one day to be brave and then I'm done. It's like, no, actually you have to choose it over and over and over again. And that's the hard part. So like, yeah, there are projects that I've begun, and I'm not going to be like, hey guys, I've made this big decision in my life. I'm not going to publish it in journals anymore. So like, I'm not going to help you finish this. That like, no, I will explain to them that it's not my priority anymore. And so like, I'm not going to push those projects, but I'm also not going to bail on them. So that's one way. And for new projects, like I make it clear to people, like it is not my aspiration to turn this into a journal article. If you're open-minded about it, I'm much more interested in like putting this up in a different form. And I can tell you like a story about how that went really well for me, and hopefully convince you that maybe it's a good idea to do. But like they also have to be willing to take on some risk. So yeah, it's not easy.
But that's kind of part of the question. It is a risk for them also.
Yes.
Or it's not people who have tenure, or people who, the one person who has tenure and is willing to take risks. Or, I don't know, people like, I don't, as you said, people who have money through some other way, maybe because they like doing science on the weekends and work during the week. The people you interact with are still mainly academics, or...
Oh, yeah.
How does that... for your scientific work, right?
Yes. Yes, in large part because that's where I met most of the people. I think in the Discord, I've never really taken a census. It seems to be a mix of people who are academics or former academics, and then people who have never been. But yeah, most of the people that I talk to, I met through doing academia, because that's what I've done for most of my life. And most of the people who want to do science like end up there at least for part of their life, if not all of it. But there are many, many discontents who like to do things in a different way, but are sort of stuck in that structure for a lot of reasons that make sense, but that also never get easier than they are today.
Yeah, I'm definitely one of them. I think I'm definitely, I should put it. let's say I'm not very skilled at dealing with things I think are stupid. And a lot of the public, just like some of the, we'll get to peer review later a bit, but it's just taken so much completely unnecessary time. And just that alone, that frustration makes me, that's also like one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you again, right? It's just because there's like, there are very few people around, it seems to me, who are actually trying to do kind of like actual proper science outside of academia, because there's also people like fill around with stuff, and that's fine, right? As we've discussed, strong link and all. But, I would like to have some sort of, I guess it's kind of the dream scenario that everyone has, right? Like somehow you just, your life's like finances are sorted, you don't need to worry about that. Now you can just do science, right? It's just very rare to see people actually trying to find a different path, rather than, as we said, pretending that they'll change once they've reached the end of the one they're on or whatever.
I think our status quo for this is a little strange. Like we, if someone really wanted to be a musician, as it sounded like you have also. Kind of the way that we expect people to go about that is like, do other stuff until you can make a living on your music. We don't expect it to be the case that like you get your PhD music job and like then do it. Which I also think like that's obviously a tough life, but it also means you have to love it a lot because you have to sacrifice a lot for it. And like, if you love this a lot, you would also sacrifice a lot for it. And I don't think it's for everybody. We've built a world where you don't have to sacrifice as much for it if you are willing to make several other very important sacrifices.
If you're willing to give me like 80% of your time, you don't have to make that many sacrifices.
Yes. And if you're willing to, go to the only place where you get the job and like have everything else be subordinate to that. Then, except for all the things you have to sacrifice, you don't have to make any sacrifices.
Exactly. Where am I going with this now? Okay, I'm not sure. I've lost an immediate next point. Shall we maybe just move to your fleet of boats and your house?
Yeah.
Do you want to briefly introduce that article? Because that's an article that particularly made me go like, yes, let's do it.
Yeah. So this is, I think, like the third in a trilogy of articles about this. The first one being "Science is a Strong Link Problem," which I think is the framework necessary for this to make sense. The second is the Secret Society post that is about like, if we take seriously the idea that science is a strong link problem, we need many people doing things in many different ways. So I encourage everyone to follow their heart and do that. And like, I'll try to build some structure for it. And this is the blueprint for like a more permanent kind of structure where rather than like, you have to figure out how to support yourself while following your scientific dreams, like this would be infrastructure that would allow people to do that. So the idea behind this post is a lot of our science reform efforts are trying to like turn this big ship of like what we all do. Like, everyone should do more of this and less of that. And I think, again, like we have an optimization problem and there's no optimizing for every problem. And so when we turn the boat like slightly this way, we become better at going in that direction, but we are not going in the previous direction at all anymore. And so rather than having one ship going in one direction, we should have many ships going in many different directions. And a lot of the effort, I think, that we put toward trying to turn that big ship, we should put toward trying to build and launch little ships. And the little ship that I would launch is a house. It could be a houseboat, but probably more landlocked than a boat. The idea being that, like, I think the way that you learn science requires a lot of, like, very deep and long conversations with someone who knows more than you and with other people who know about as much as you, but who want to know more as well. Like, this was how I became a scientist, right? Like, I steeped in a lab for a long time. I spent 5 years talking for multiple hours every week with my advisor. And, like, that is what honed my intuitions. And so I think we don't
talk about that a bit more?
Yeah.
Because that's really interesting to me, because I guess most people don't have that. So I'm curious, what that looked like and how it worked. And
Yeah.
I mean, so this was with Dan Gilbert. Is it Gilbert or Gilbert?
Gilbert, yeah.
Gilbert, yeah.
I ended up working at his, when I was an undergrad, I read his book, Stumbling on Happiness, and I was like, this is really cool. And then I got an email that was forwarded by the psych department being like, hey, Dan Gilbert's lab is looking for research assistants for this summer. I was like, wait, this guy lives on Earth? Like, you can talk to him? Like, you can actually do work with him? Like, not just take a class from him, right? Like, you can help him produce knowledge. So I went there for one summer. it was just really fun. Like the environment was so stimulating. People were always talking about interesting stuff. They all had like weird, interesting takes on things I'd never thought about before. That's where I honed like many of my most basic scientific skills, was like working as a research assistant. Like, how do you build a study? Like, how do you run it? How do you do like the basics of data analysis? I came back a second summer, and I knew that's where I wanted to go for my PhD. Like, I wanted to spend a lot of time in that environment. And when I started, Dan began our first meeting by saying like, hey, someone asked me recently, like, what % of my life goals have I achieved? And I told him 140%. I've done more than I ever thought that I would. And like, basically the rest is gravy to me. So like, let's just talk about interesting stuff. So like, what ideas do you have? And we spent 6 months just talking about ideas. Like, I'd come in once, sometimes twice a week with like 3 new ideas, and we'd go through each of them, and I'd like pitch it to him, and we'd talk about it. You're like, oh, well, okay, what about this? Or like, if that's true, then like this thing is true. And I can't really describe to you the process of like what it is to like open up an idea and look inside it and see like, is there anything in there? 90-something% of those ideas went nowhere. Like, they weren't interesting enough, or we didn't think that they were true. I think in a smaller case, or a smaller number of cases, we thought that they had been done before, so we didn't do them. And the few that like survived one conversation and survived the next conversation and survived like 5 conversations became the projects that we ultimately worked on. And I think that is like how I developed my scientific faculties, is sitting for a long time in a room with someone who had better faculties than me and talking about ideas with them and seeing the way that he thought about ideas. And talking to people in my lab and talking to people in my graduate cohort who entered in the same year. Like, these, I think it's difficult to like speed that process up. It is like a process of almost acculturation, but I think it isn't just arbitrary like a lot of elements of culture are, because I think it is like actually trying to get you better at discovering things that are true and important. And so the idea behind a science house would be to try to like form a crucible where that is the point of what we're doing. I mean, to your point that not many people get that, I think it's a huge failing of academia, that like that is supposed to be what it's good at doing, is like putting people in contact with mentors and with other people who are also trying to answer the same question, and giving them a lot of freedom and allowing them to talk to one another a lot. The fact that happens, like, the fact that that doesn't happen more often than not is, I think, like sort of like setting money on fire. Like, that's the thing that it's supposed to do. It doesn't do that. So Science House would be a place where like the point is doing that. And I guess I never really said what the plan is, but the plan is like you get a house and students live in the house. Their mentor lives in a different house, because like when you're young and living together, the mentor should live elsewhere. Like they should okay. They should have I think the freedom to live in a house of young people.
You didn't live with Dan.
No, I didn't live with Dan. I think that was for the best. That we each had our own space and our own lives, but we spent a lot of time together. And that would be the idea, that like you spend a lot of time with your colleagues, you spend a lot of time with this mentor, and rather than producing journal articles, which is the point of being in a PhD program, like the point is to produce scientific projects that you then put on the internet, written in words that anyone can understand. Which I think all sounds very reasonable, and I think people are maybe surprised to find that like that isn't what academia is even trying to do. Like, if that happens, it's sort of a byproduct. But yeah, that's the idea.
Yeah, it's always, just briefly about the supervisor thing, it's always kind of so sad is not quite the right word, but let's just use it anyway. So sad when you see people and, you know, they get like, I have this black problem with my supervisor, and you go like, well, you know, why don't you talk to them about this and that? They're like, yeah, that's not how it works. And it's just like, there's this whole thing of like, you can't really talk to them. Yeah. Like about like it's, you have to manage the relationship with the supervisor.
Yeah.
And it probably depends like on where you are and all that kind of stuff, but it's shocking how many people have that kind of relationship with their supervisor. Yeah. And it's just, in some sense, I mean, some of it might actually be productive, because you kind of have to really defend your ideas, because they're not going to go with it unless it's like really obviously good. But it just, also seems to me not the right way to do science.
Yeah. I knew a guy in grad school who he got to send an email to his advisor, or like sometimes that's like every 3 weeks or something, his advisor would like reply to an email. Like, his job was like to produce like a long document for his advisor to read and go like, no. Like, keep thinking, to be like, okay, I spent 3 months working on that. And yeah, it seemed to me like such a waste.
Yeah. But anyway, I mean, well, that's the sad thing. I mean, it's not like this is a huge podcast, but enough now that there will be some people in the audience to whom exactly that applies. Yeah. Which is always, and maybe even a supervisor who's like that listening. Yeah. But obviously not you thinking about this right now. You're the good supervisor. But obviously the bad supervisor not going to feel addressed by that.
No, of course.
Maybe I'm slightly jumping ahead with my questions, but I'm just really curious. Like, is this something you're trying to do? Is there this is all a metaphor, but also is there an actual house? Have you surveyed land?
No, I don't have the money to do this. I do know where I would put the house in Cambridge, Massachusetts, both because like that is a place I'd like to live long term, but also I'd like it to be in a place where the students of Science House could like talk to a lot of students in traditional academic programs for the benefit of both. I think like if I was in a PhD and I met someone from Science House, I'd be like, wait, you can do that? And I think it would shatter a lot of my assumptions about like, oh, this is the way that things have to be done. And I think we could learn stuff too from the way that they do things. That I think it would be good for both kinds of students to see one another.
Sorry, but you realize students are not going to allowed to go to your house because they'll just be they'll be like, leave my students alone. I'm trying to get them to write papers. Now they have all these ideas.
Yes,
stop it.
Yes, secretly that is what I hope. That they would get addicted to the secret truth of how science can really be done, and then the spell of the bad supervisor would be broken, because part of that spell works by people thinking that this is the way that we have to do it. But yeah, I've talked to a few people who are interested in this idea. I mean, if there's anyone listening who like thinks that this should happen, I'm happy to talk to them. So yes, I don't have the money it takes now, and I don't have the house in mind. But this is something that like is a project that I hope to accomplish before I die. Anyway,
that's really cool. Yeah, I mean, as I said, like this whole idea sounds super cool to me. I mean, in some sense, again, it does seem a bit. I think part of the reason why it's so appealing because it's kind of a suggestion to say like, hey, do you want all the upside without any of the downside? That's kind of what this whole thought experiment is. And but I liked your kind of hypothetical, like how much would this cost? Because I think what did you say? Like it would be like maybe. Do you have the numbers? Otherwise, I'll have to.
As a rough estimate, it would cost $15 million to endow this forever. Right, you could run it on the interest income from $15 million minus what it would cost to buy the house in the first place.
Yeah, and I think then that was about $500,000 of annual salary expenses.
Yes,
right?
Yeah, something like that.
Which, well, I guess it's a house, so boarding is provided.
Yes.
What's interesting to me is that I have no idea what it's like in the US, but in Europe, some of the big grants, if you have like what's it called, like an ERC consolidated grant or Wellcome Trust, whatever grant, I think they can often be like, I think the biggest ones are usually like 3 million euros or something like that, apart from maybe some like exceptionally big ones. But usually it's like, I think like the big ones are, you get it for like 4 years, you spend like 1.5 million, or you get 1.5 million or whatever. And it's kind of crazy to me to think like it would take about, let's say, 5 to 10 of those to just have the house.
Yeah. That runs itself. And like, I mean, look, I've never, launched a nonprofit or even bought a house before. It could be that like, no, actually, it turns out there's so much more that you need to do to make this work. I mean, I've thought through like, okay, yes, you need to pay like legal expenses to like make this happen. You need to pay to keep the house up. But yeah, I mean, a lot of the reason why things are so expensive in academia is because like the institutions are so big, you have to support an army of bureaucrats that like keep the money coming in. And like you end up in a world where, I mean, the comparison I use in the piece is like Harvard spends $15 million a year on postage. Yeah, I think phones are actually about that amount again. So like, okay. I mean, it's just like landlines, which like most people aren't even using anymore. But postage alone at Harvard is nearly $15 million a year. And so like, look, I think Harvard does a lot of good stuff. Obviously, it's a big institution. Like it supports many people who are doing important work. But how do we get to the point where it makes sense to spend $15 million on postage? I think like part of that is the like insanity that comes from scale. Like supposedly you get efficiency from scale, and obviously you can in some ways. But I think when you're talking about bureaucracy, I think you often get insanity from scale.
Yeah. But one I think fairly immediate and obvious criticism of this is to say like, well, how do you think universities started out? Right? Like someone had a bunch of money, gave it to people to kind of think outside of the box and have some cool thoughts. And over time, they all end up becoming these big bureaucracies. And I mean, to maybe, I don't know if this analogy is going to help at all, but there's a really cool episode of the Behind the Bastards podcast where they talk about people who see them, what's it called, like the very, like politically completely independent government should not exist kind of thing. Anyway, they sometimes buy boats because in international seas there's no laws. Mm-hmm. And then they all end up kind of reinventing kind of a state, right? They kind of always like, oh no, someone hit someone or killed someone. Now we need someone to enforce like that people don't hit other people. And you know, just you recreate government basically. So like, I'm wondering like, how are you not going to do that? Is it just because it's smaller? It's not supposed to grow, or like,
that's part of it. I mean, first, I think that like a lot of the downsides that like the things that we dislike the most about academia, I think are of somewhat recent vintage. They worked very differently, I think, several generations ago. I mean, basically before they got really big and pretty fat off of government funding. So they have the advantage now that like they're much bigger and can do much more things. But the disadvantage is all the bureaucracy that came from that. So yeah, so if you get a run of 300 years where things are really good before things start going south, I also think that's pretty good if you got that for $15 million. Another thing is like, I think this actually really comes down to like the quality and values of the people that you put in charge of these places. You cannot optimize, or you can't guarantee, right, that they will never fall into the wrong hands. But I do think they really depend on the right person running them. And I think they really depend on having this value of like, the point is not to acquire additional houses. Like I'm happy to help set up other houses that do this independently. But for me, the ethos is like, the point is the house, one house. If there's any more houses, other people are doing them independently. Like the maximum that I want us to like interact with one another is like, can we pool our resources in terms of like the accounting costs and like how much it costs to like have a barbecue together? But in terms of administration, like no, each of these should be unto their own, because the idea is that we're trying to take many different approaches. Not in the sense of like many different departments in a university where we're all kind of doing the same thing, but I do it for chemistry and you do it for physics. Like, no, we're literally trying to do different things. And so our approaches should be very idiosyncratic. They should not be centrally controlled, which also means that like they could go in weird directions. And I think part of believing this idea is also like, I think having the guts to be like, yeah, some of these might fail, but like you can't have the upside without the exposure to the gut. Yeah.
But okay, so I mean, it's just funny because, as I said, I really liked reading the article, and it stirred some revolutionary thoughts inside me. And now I feel I'm observing myself bringing up a bunch of criticisms or like potential problems with it, which is kind of interesting. But I guess it's more to kind of explore the idea rather than to say why it wouldn't work. But then, okay, who gets to decide who lives in the house? Just you? Because then it becomes a cult.
I mean, a lot of labs actually turn out to be cults. So if I was running the house, yeah, it'd be me. I think that like
have tenure. What's the kind of do you have like 3 people who have tenure indefinitely? Is it kind of what's the structure of? Is it like a PhD? People come in for 4 years, leave again.
That would be the idea for the students would be you come for a fixed term. I think probably 4 years in which you are trained, and then you're done. And
sorry, you wrote that in.
Yeah. I also think, or at least I built into the budget enough for there to be at least one visiting scholar at any point. So I wouldn't be the only older person who's there. Because like I also don't want to be the sole like mentor to 4 people. Like you should have a diversity in mentorship as well. And so I'd always want there to be someone else that you can learn from who like has a different perspective on like how to develop as a scientist.
Yeah, and I think if I remember correctly, the argument was people don't stay in academia anyway, so why are we pretending? Why are we training them specifically to do this? Why not just spend 4 years instead of doing a PhD, you spend 4 years doing cool stuff and learning how to think? That was kind of also part of the argument, right?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That like, when I talk to like other friends in academia, they're like, well, but they couldn't get an academic job afterward. And I'm like, you're not going to get an academic job afterward. So like, why worry about it? In fact, I think it's much more freeing to be like, well, obviously I'm not going to do that class of jobs. What class of jobs like could I do? And I think the answer is like, well, a lot of them, because if you are developing your skills in like solving scientific problems, writing about them in accessible language, like those are things like those are useful people who could go in a lot of different directions. I also think they're going to be pretty weird people to begin with who are willing to take a risk on this, who I think are going to be less interested in the most conventional types of jobs anyway. So I wouldn't feel bad about like, I'm not going to make you more competitive for doing a conventional academic job. But if you're coming here, that's not what you want anyway. What you want to do is something weird. And like, I will help you get much better at doing something weird.
Oh, that would be amazing. Just like it's not even productive. Just society just gets weirder in some undefinable way through your psychology.
Yeah,
but I guess that would just
I think that'd be
house.
great.
That would not be anyone else's house necessarily. There might be houses really, very straightforward, kind of do science in the proper way. And then there's the weird madhouse that's yours.
Yeah, I mean, I think all these would sort of be a little inherently weird, because if you weren't, like, why wouldn't you just go to where the structures are set up the way that you like them already? So I think you'd be a little bit wasted if that's what you wanted to do. Yeah,
it's fair enough. Yeah, it's funny. Whilst we're talking about like the skills you would build there, I was reminded of Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, where he said basically like he's trying to be a monk and does all of that, all of the Buddhism. He does a lot of that for a while, and then realizes he doesn't want to do it. Goes to a businessman and says like, "I want to work for you." And he says like, "Well, what can you do?" And he says, "Well, I can think, and I can fast, and I can wait." He's like, "That's all." That's like, yeah, that's about it. But like, what do you think about? It's like, I can't do those three things. I'm like, if I could do those three things, I would be pretty well off. So I think if you can teach how to think through things, that's probably more than I've learned in my PhD. Yeah.
And even just to produce something that is like readable and interesting. That, I mean, a lot of people who get hired, for instance, into industry out of PhD programs, like, it's not that the people hiring you like read your papers and are like, oh, this paper is so good. They like the fact that they know you can like deal with complex stuff. You probably have data analysis skills. You maybe have some content knowledge if you're like getting hired as a biologist to like do biology VC stuff. But it's not, I think, that they really like value the particular academic work that you've done, because they probably can't assess it unless they're also an expert. What if they could assess it? And what if they could see like, hey, you wrote this article that I understood and that taught me something and that answered a problem that I thought was interesting? I would want to hire a person like that. Whereas someone who's like, guess what? I know how to play the game of academia and like publish a paper. I'd be like, like, yeah, you can play that game, but we're playing a different game over here. It's like, I don't care that you're really good at Scrabble. Like, we're playing soccer.
Yeah. I mean, it's also like, especially when you think about like, let's say I published in Science, right? It sounds vaguely made up. It's like when you publish science in science.
Yeah.
Like, if you're not in academia, then it probably doesn't really make sense. Like, that doesn't sound like it's a real thing.
Yeah, I performed at concert hall.
Yeah.
Like, okay, sure.
Yeah, good for you. Okay, so what's who's allowed into the house? Is there, I'm assuming, older than 18? Do they have to have some degree? Or is it just interesting people?
Yeah, I think so. I think that this would be like sensible for the kind of person who might have otherwise gone to a PhD program. So they're probably done with undergrad. Maybe they've done some stuff in between, and which is also like a fairly wide range of ages, but not infinitely wide. Which is also like what I'm particularly interested in working with, like that group of people. I could see a different science house that's like, no, we're all about people who are in the middle of their careers and want to do something else that's weird, and who we assume like have really great skills from whatever they were doing, and now we're going to repurpose them to do different stuff. Like, that would be cool too. It's just not the thing that that I see myself doing. Because like, I really like talking to that particular group of people. Yeah, that's what I would do.
I guess we're doing kind of two things at the same time here. One is the bigger point of your little boats, and then the houses, and specifically we're talking through what you would do in yours if you randomly. I mean, you'd have to have quite a few subscribers on Substack to have $50 million. But I don't think you're quite there. I don't know how much you charge.
No, I'm not there. I'm not there. I hope to be one day. I mean, I'd love to see octogenarian house, right? That like is a science house just of 80-year-olds.
I mean, they'll probably have a lot more, many more interesting questions than a bunch of like 22-year-olds.
Sure.
Right? I mean,
certainly different questions.
Yeah.
But I mean, just to think about the fact that like there doesn't exist a place for them. Like no one would even think about doing such a thing. I mean, some people would argue like that is what academia is. It's octogenarian house.
Yeah, that is what tenure is. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm looking forward to the house. I don't know whether I already have a PhD. I don't know whether I can apply. It's also, I mean, but the funny thing is, like, to me, it's, I mean, again, part of the appeal is like that you kind of, get a lot of the upsides without a lot of the downsides. That's, that's part of the appeal. But I still find it interesting, like, just how excited I get when I, read your articles about it, when I go like, yeah, that would be amazing if I didn't have to do stupid peer review or like, not peer review, but like respond to like some stupid comments that I got that are completely pointless. Now I have to spend half an hour explaining why it's silly rather than just ignoring it, which I could if a friend wrote it, right? And so, even though, so this is already exciting me, but I'm not even interested in the same topic as what you're doing, but I still want to be like, maybe I should do it anyway,
Yeah. Yeah. Like, even if, if someone came to me and was like, I'm going to set this up, but like, I'm a wizard and I will only do it at the cost of like you never being able to run one. I'd be like, okay, I just really actually want this to exist. It's partly my dream because I think I'd be good at doing it and it's something I'd really like to do. But if you were like, I'm going to give it to someone else who I think would do a good job doing it, I'd be like, well, I just want it to be out there. Like, I want people to see that this is possible. And I want to see what people do when they're put in this environment where they can do that kind of thing. And I know, like, from the outside, it does have this like vibe of like, what if all the upsides and none of the downsides? There'd obviously be downsides, right? Like the people in science, I'm sure, would complain about things like we have to think about running the house too, right? We're like totally lost of what we work on all the time. Like, I just think it's actually really worthwhile for there to be different upsides and different downsides. And I think like we actually can do better overall at in terms of our mix of upsides and downsides than we do right now in a PhD program, where it seems to me like the median of the distribution is mediocre. Like, some people have a pretty good time, many people have a terrible time, and like the middle person I think has like an okay time. Which is crazy because supposedly everything's taken care of. Like, you have enough money to live on, probably could use more. But like, supposedly you have a lot of freedom. Like, you're around other people who are supposed to be smart and interesting. You're supposed to have the guidance of an advisor. And for some reason, these things just like kind of don't work out most of the time, which is why I think it wouldn't be that hard to do better.
One thing that just occurred to me is that, do you wonder whether, not having restrictions can often be harder than having restrictions? Because number one, if you have restrictions, you've got something to work against. You have something to work with and that kind of stuff. If we want to take a cynical view, basically what you're saying, like, what I would really like is if someone gave me and my friends money to just hang out, and I could very easily see how just nothing happens for 4 years. It's like it starts off excited and then just like, yeah, I don't know, I want to like play video games today, and the whole thing just falls apart. Do you think? To provide maybe why I'm thinking about this is because right now I have basically nothing to do. I just handed in my PhD. I've got like 3 weeks of just nothing. And I've wasted at least the first week of that. And part of that is reaction to what came before, but in general, constraints are usually good. So are there any? Or what would you do? Maybe. I guess every house does it differently, but
yeah. I think in terms of the danger of like, do people just hang out and do nothing? I think you should trust what people were doing before you started looking at them, which is also how I would think about selecting people for the house. That like, I think if you look back at what I've done, like, I was doing this stuff before anybody was looking and before I made any money on it, like just because I liked doing it, which I think is a pretty good signal that like, I do actually want to do this. And that's what I would be looking for in the kind of people that I would want to select for Science House. That like, I would not want a traditional application where it's like, lie to me in the form of a personal statement about why you want to be here. Like, no, I want to look at what you're doing right now and see that before you even knew this was possible, you were doing this. That like, I have put out there, right? The call to like, put science on the internet. And I understand that like, some people don't have time or the ability to do it, but I'd be happy to see even people doing a bad job at this, but who really want it. That's the kind of person that I would want, because I would trust that when they get there, what I'm giving them is like the support to live their life, some structure and some guidance. And I expect that I would unlock the thing that they always wanted to do because they were willing to do it, even when it was costly and gave them no benefit at all. And in the Science House that I would run, like, I don't quite think it would be like it was with Dan when I showed up, that I'm just like, let's just do whatever. Hopefully at that time, it's like we have an idea for a paradigm in psychology. And so we do actually think there are some questions that are really important to answer. There are many questions within there that might be worth working on. And so it's not going to be like, hey, now you have this thing to do. But I think it would make sense to have something more focused. At the same time, like if we get to talking about something and it's like, actually, that's really interesting, we can work on that. Like we have the freedom to do that. But I agree with you, like it is hard, especially if you don't have that much experience, to come in and just be like, here's my really interesting idea. Yeah, I think that is part of what we're training people to get.
I mean, I guess it's also in the sense that you do have at least one more experienced person, i.e. you, to kind of provide some guidance. Maybe briefly, you wrote an article about, or a Substack post about, I think this was you, about how, applications and that kind of stuff are silly. Especially, oh yes, of course it was you, yeah, the whole roads thing. And how would you, I mean, it seems like you might spend a lot of time with the people, but how do you, let's say, it's 5 years, you've got an inkling of a paradigm. How are you going to find the right people? Assuming, one question is, how do you even attract the right people? That's maybe the first place to start, because if you post it on Nature Jobs, you're going to get a certain kind of person. And if you post it on your Substack, a different kind of person. So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, one way is by like putting the things out there that I think are important and see who responds to them, right? Like who joins the Discord? What do they do? That I think is a source of the kind of people that I'm looking for. A friend of mine teaches at like a weird hippie college in the woods, which I think attracts often the right kind of person who's like kind of weird, but very ambitious. I think that is another source. It's difficult to ever be comprehensive, right? So I would still want there to be some way of like, I have no idea who you are and we have no connection to one another through our social network, but like you can tell me that you are interested in doing this. And really, I want that to be like maybe like 2 lines, which is your name and like your, like the thing that you want me to see on the internet, which is ideally like work that you've done already that shows me that you're actually interested in doing it. Because if you've never done anything like this before and you're like, but I really want to, it seems unclear. Like it kind of seems like maybe you don't want to. And that's what I'm trying to do with these posts, is like to lower the bar for people doing that. That like, even if it's a bad PDF on a dumb idea that like you didn't run correctly, like just do it. Just put it on the internet. I get a lot of emails from people who are like, I'm thinking about this project. And I usually say, just do it. Write it up. Like it does not matter if it is bad, especially because the only way you'll get better is by doing it the first time. And so the kind of person who does that is the kind of person that I would want to keep working with.
Yeah, it's fair. Yeah, I want to do it, but I never have. It's like, well, yeah, do you really? Or you actually want to, but you think, yeah, you're like so entrenched in the idea of like you need the qualifications, you need the whatever to do it. That's also not going to be useful for your idea.
Yes. Yeah.
So I wanted to talk briefly about peer review, which is one of my main frustrations, let's say. Which probably also doesn't reflect too well on me that I'm so frustrated with it. But what I wanted to ask is, like, I guess some of the objections to peer review are, I mean, you've written about it, other people have talked about it. We don't need to go over all of them right now. Maybe one question I kind of have is, like, how do you, in a system where basically, how do you cultivate good feedback? Because I think one actually really useful thing about peer review is that it kind of forces people to actually read your thing and comment on it. Not everything that comes back is necessarily sensible, but I mean, from my experience, maybe this is just the people I know, but they're not super reliable in sending you feedback when you want it to, whereas peer review does tend to happen within the expected time frame, more or less. So I'm curious, like, how do you want to ensure that you get good outside perspective on what you're doing, and it's not just 5 people in a house just thinking they're amazing?
I think part of it is making a thing that people want to read in the first place. I think being ignored is often a piece of feedback, like maybe good or maybe bad, right? That like if Bach was ignored for 150 years, like he seems still good, well, that's fine. But I mean, when I posted things could be better on the internet, like I did not expect many people to like notice or care or comment. And a lot of people did. And like that wasn't because they were like guilted into doing it. Like I still get reviews from people who like respond because they were interested. And I think those are actually the reviews that you want. The review from the person who's guilted into reviewing your paper probably isn't going to give you as good of feedback, or the person who's doing it because they are acting as a gatekeeper. What they are doing is trying to figure out, like, should I lift the gate for your piece? Which isn't actually the question that I want answered. I want to know, like, how do I answer the question that I was trying to answer? And one of those answers might be, I don't think this was a good question to ask in the first place. So yeah, I think one way is doing the kind of work that attracts people in the first place, and putting it in like communicating it in a way that allows people to communicate back to you. The other way, I think, is by training people to give the kind of feedback that you want to give. And part of the way of doing this is like to give that kind of feedback. I was working with that same friend who teaches at that hippie college. We were talking about like what should his final project assignment be for this class that he was teaching, and we came up with this idea of like, why don't you like try to like write a helpful review to someone whose work that you read. That like the point here isn't like trying to decide whether it should be published or not, but to be like, hey, I see what you're doing. I'm interested in it. This is my way of trying to help you, which might mean like, here, I noticed that like something's wrong in your code, or like, I have an idea. I wonder if you've thought about this, which is the way that I would like to be interacted with as a scientist, right? Like I'm happy when people write to me and they're actually interested in the thing that I'm trying to do, rather than like I've come to them as a supplicant. So I think that is how. I mean, people say that like if you want to learn something, just post the wrong answer on the internet and people will correct you immediately. And I do think that is like kind of broadly true.
Yeah. By the way, has the feedback for things could be better, has that been useful?
Yeah. I've edited the paper in response to it. Like most concretely, one person was like, I think actually the graphs would be better if you like flip the X and Y axes. And because I think it actually shows more clearly the thing that you are trying to show. It's like, oh, actually, that's a good point. And I just like flipped the axes, like uploaded a new version. I heard from so some of the people that we cited in it, like the person whose optimism bias work that we cited wrote to us and was like, I actually got into studying optimism biases in part because like I was sort of trying to answer a similar question to you. And like, here's a case where I think it might turn off. So yeah, we got a ton of good feedback, like useful feedback, and more so than when I've submitted to journals, because like a lot of the feedback is like hostile. Like they didn't actually care. They're not trying to help me. Like if anything, they're trying to like, I don't know, help like the journal in a weird way. And so, yeah, I also tried to model this with other people that I try to give the kind of feedback that I would want to receive, like both freely and openly. So,
yeah, I mean, to some extent, it seems to me that your model, so to speak, if it's already a working model, requires some sort of, not fame exactly, but you have to, I mean, as I said, like no one saying anything is some sort of feedback too, but it's not exactly a high-grained feedback. Like you don't know why it's not working. I don't know, does that just limit who can do it? That you have to, I mean, for example, one of the reasons you have probably got so much feedback is because you're very good at writing in a funny way and it's entertaining, right? And many people don't have that, right? It's just like, me included, right? Like I'm not judging other people. Like for me, humorous writing is, I mean, it's not something I ever really tried to do, right? So yeah, does that limit, yeah, I mean, do you have to be an entertaining writer for this to work or?
No, I don't think so. I think in part because the way that people originally found this paper wasn't because I posted it on my blog, which at the time even had many fewer subscribers than now. Like people found it because I uploaded it to PsyArchive, and there's a PsyArchive Twitter bot, and people found it through that. And like they originally clicked on it literally based on the title. They kept reading it because of what it said. And like, yeah, I'm proud of that paper. I think it's well written. I think it's funny. But I think part of the reason it's funny isn't because like we tried to write a bunch of jokes into it. It was like we just described what was happening in like language that we would use. And I think that like I think most people, if they wrote honestly about the things that they did, like their papers would be a lot funnier than they are now. Like it wouldn't transform everyone into a great writer. I think it would transform most people into better writers. Because if you want to talk about like what makes things more accessible, like certainly it cannot be that you have to express yourself in like this sort of fake academic language. That it has to be easier for people to use the words that they would use normally. So like, yeah, no, I don't think this is restricted to people who are just good at writing or who just have an online following. In fact, I think it is less restricted than the version of this where like you have to know all these norms and speak in this language in order to get your piece out there. Which again is not even a guarantee that anyone but the reviewers will read it, and the reviewers might not even really read it. So I think it's actually more accessible.
Yeah. Okay. Do you have anything else to add? Otherwise, I'd go to the recurring questions.
Let's do it.
Okay. Question number 1. I don't know why I number them. Anyway, question number 1. A book or paper, or maybe in your case, I'll allow a blog post.
All right.
That more people should read. This can be a hidden gem that you found, a paper from the 40s that no one's read. It could be super famous, but people should read again. Anything comes to mind?
Yeah, I'm glad you allow blog posts because mine would be The Scientific Virtues by the pseudonymous bloggers called Slime Mold, Time Mold. It is the thing that I like my first recommendation to anyone beginning to be a scientist. I mean, really to anybody, but it's a great starting point. It is a blog post about like how the practice of science is actually the cultivation of certain virtues, and the virtues are all the opposites of the things that you think that they would be. It is like stupidness, and or stupidity, whichever. It doesn't matter, because I'm cultivating the virtue of whatever that dumb thing is: laziness, stupidity, arrogance. And they include a lot of quotes from famous scientists who clearly embody these virtues. And the point being that like people think that what you learn to do when you learn to be a scientist is like, you learn how to like put stuff in a petri dish, and you learn how to analyze data, and you learn how to read a paper. And like those are things that you might learn in the process of doing whatever you're doing. But like you are actually becoming a certain kind of person, and the kind of person that you should become is a person who embodies these virtues. So I really recommend people reading. I come back to it very often. So yeah, that's my piece.
Okay. I'll find that and put that in the description. Just briefly, because last time I think we talked, you also mentioned slime mold, time mold, and I haven't checked. I always thought it was one person, but it's multiple people, right? Can you maybe provide a bit of background, because it seems like you like them a lot?
Yeah. I'm good friends with them. And they were actually instrumental in me starting a blog in the first place. Basically, they wouldn't leave me alone until I did. And it was partly seeing them be successful. I mean, having the silliest name in the world, like clearly not writing to like impress anybody, not writing to be taken seriously. And they had a lot of success on their blog, and they were able to do some cool stuff, like run internet trials where people ate nothing but potatoes for a month. And it really changed what I thought was possible to do. And so they've been very influential in me. So that's part of why I talk about them a lot and try to encourage people to read them.
And they are scientists, or used to be, or what's the?
They're slime molds.
Okay.
I think that if you look at them and you ask the question of what are their credentials, I think you have not learned what they have to teach you.
Yeah, well, it's not about credentials. It's more like I'm just curious, like whether they are people who, roughly followed your path or went a completely different path, or I don't know. I think this might just be your alter ego.
People have thought that before and been disappointed. So yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll read it and then I'll see. What's something you wish you'd learned sooner? And this can be from private work, whatever you want. And maybe if you have already learned it, how did you deal with it, or what was the consequence of your learning?
Yeah. This is a hard one to answer, because I don't necessarily like wish my life would have taken some kind of different course. And so if I could go back in time and say anything to myself, I just might not do it. The paradox is maybe too big, but.
Or maybe it's just something important you learned.
Yeah. Something that I think is time sensitive is like this idea of living in accordance with your values. Like it only gets more difficult, and the best time to do it is now. Especially when you are young, people feed you this idea, like we talked about this before, that like you just need to live in a different way for a while, and then you can do the things that you want to do. And I've now been around long enough to see that like people will sell you that scam at every point, that like they will tell you that you always need to have a little bit more than you have before you have enough. To the point where, like, when I was at Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship, the warden of Rhodes House, like the person in charge of it, once like tried to convince a bunch of us that like what you guys really need to do after this is like go work for McKinsey, a consulting company, which he had worked for. He's like, you need to go there, like build some skills. And I'm like, well, what are we doing here? Like, I thought this was the time when we were building skills, and like after this we could do whatever. And so if at that point, if after like winning this prestigious scholarship and getting a master's degree from a prestigious university, if at that point people are like, no, you're not, keep going. Like, nobody is ever going to tell you that the time is right to be brave. So I guess I will, that the time is right now. It is not a single decision. Like, you have to keep choosing it over and over again. And I think the only things that really help are close contact with other people who are also trying to do the same thing. I think you can't do it alone, or it's really hard to do it alone. It's very lonely. And that's why people end up not doing it, because they put themselves in places where other people are not trying to do this, or they've given up on this. They're like, well, but I do need to build my skills at McKinsey before I can do the thing that I think is actually good for the world. And it's like, well, by the time you've spent the 5 years building concentration camps in China, like, then you're good. Then do you think you're really going to come back and do the opposite? Like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I think I'll actually just go on to the next question, because I feel like it might be similar. Your answer might be similar, which is, so I just handed in my PhD. I'll start a postdoc at some point in the next few months. And I'm actually, all criticism of academia aside, I'm really looking forward to doing that. But as I mentioned, like, I don't know whether I want to spend my, large portions of my life grading essays or applying for fellowships, or I don't know what. Any advice?
Yeah. Apparently there was someone at like Bell Labs or something that used to walk around and ask people like, what's the most important problem in your field? And then people would tell him, and he'd go, are you working on that? And people would invariably tell him no. And he'd go, why? So something like that. I don't even know what Bell Labs, whatever. But I think the question is a good one. And I think especially when you're starting something new, I think it's worth asking yourself that like, what do you think is most important to work on? And like, what good reason do you have for not working on it? Because I don't think that there's a good reason. You will think of many reasons, but I don't think there is ultimately a good reason. If it's the most important thing to do, I think it is how you should spend your time. And I think it may be scary to do that because it feels like we should opt into this idea of like, I'll do that later when I have enough stored up. And I don't think you'll do it later. I think it is easy. It'll only get harder to do it in the future. So I think you should do it now.
Okay. I'll apply to McKinsey tomorrow.
Somebody's got to build the concentration camps. They're not going to build themselves.
Sorry, is that something they're doing?
This is. I mean, I'm speaking somewhat facetiously, but yeah, like every couple of years, a whistleblower comes out of McKinsey being like, "Oh, we helped this dictator," and so I think one of them is actually building. Obviously, the Chinese government would not call them concentration camps for the Uyghur Muslim minority. Camps, right? Yes, exactly. But yeah, they've been involved in projects like that. At least is my understanding. I don't want to get sued for defamation by McKinsey. This is what I have heard. I have no firsthand knowledge that this is the case. It just seems likely to me. And so that if that is going on, which again, I have no idea if it is or not, people seem to be saying that it is. I just don't think people should be doing that, even if you are well remunerated for doing it.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess if you... Yeah, I mean, I don't know anything about consulting, so I'm not going to add anything to that.
Yeah.
It was the kind of career that seemed very cool when I was about 16, and then very quickly not anymore.
Yeah.
Anyway, well, this took a very positive end.
I mean, I think so. I think like
don't work for concentration camps.
Yeah, well, definitely don't do that. And then I think like people say so cynically, follow your dreams. I think they know that they're cynical when they say it because they're like, but no one actually can do that. I think you can. I just think you can. I think it is actually really hard, and it's hard not in the ways that you imagine that it is. Like it is hard to continue to choose to do it every day because we think that like you can make the choice once and it feels really good and that's what keeps you going. And like, yes, it does keep you going, but you have to keep choosing it and you have to keep like still looking kind of ridiculous for doing it. But if you're optimizing for not looking ridiculous, like I think you're going to have I think you're going to find yourself in a local minimum.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.